ado, I will turn this program over to David's very capable hands, and we look forward to hearing what he has to say.
Well, thank you, Marianne. It's a real pleasure to be here. The League of Women Voters, of course, has a storied past and a very important mission in the present and future, so thank you for this opportunity. Some people ask me how I came into the topic area of women's activism, and it's a complicated story, but I've always been interested on an academic and personal level in how oppressed people claim political power, and that's the genesis of my interest, in addition to the fact that I have two daughters, a very active wife who just was elected in the last election to the Johnson County Board of County Commissioners. So we have a big personal commitment to the political process. Kelly Welch, the executive director of Sheffield Place, has always referred to me as the agency's, it's a staff that's primarily female, but she refers to me as the leading feminist on the staff. So I take this very seriously, and hope you'll enjoy learning about women's activism in Kansas City, which has a very rich history, and I'm honored to be here to share that with you. On January 19th, 1895, a group of activist women from across Kansas City held their regularly scheduled meeting. The order of business included an exercise known as the Suffrage Catechism, in which the leader posed a series of questions to the assembled members. In response to the question, how were the principles of equality first violated by the American Republic, a particularly strident woman and a leader of a national women's organization responded, by disenfranchising poor people and people not belonging to a church, and idiots, imbeciles, slaves, and women. Which is that quote is the chapter title in the book. Scholars have extensively examined the formation, operation, and influence of women's organizations at the national level and regionally, but they've really avoided or overlooked the Midwestern metropolis like Kansas City, that was a rapidly growing city, and particularly those on the borders of free and slave states. Today, I'd like to close that gap just a little bit by looking closely at the politics and history of women's activism in Kansas City between the opening of the Hannibal Railroad Bridge in 1869 and the fall of the Pendergast era in 1940. Over the course of those 70 years, women in Kansas City strove to emerge from the domestic sphere to claim space as full participants in the American polity through activism in the forms of benevolence, moral reform, and equality, leading, of course, eventually to the right to vote. It's important to talk a little bit about Kansas City history. We need to start with the cross-border conflict that was caused by the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the concept of popular sovereignty. I'm sure you all remember this from your history. It allowed the residents of Kansas to determine for themselves whether they would enter as a slave or a free state. Pro-slavery forces in Missouri had long assumed that Kansas would be a slave state, but the rapid influx of Easterners and Northerners changed the regional complexion of Kansas City to one that was heavily influenced by this free state view. This sectional divide in Kansas City and the region would be evident in the decades to follow, and I think some could argue that it's even evident today in some circumstances. After the rapid period of population growth in the 1850s and early 1860s, the Civil War caused Kansas City to lose population. After the war, the turning point in Kansas City was the construction of the Hannibal Railroad Bridge. I'm sure you've all heard about the Hannibal Railroad Bridge. It connected Kansas City to Chicago, and it was the only link across the river. There were trains that went from St. Louis, but connection to Chicago was essential, as it was a crossing point on the Missouri River. Other towns, such as St. Louis and Leavenworth and Atchison, were in contention for the bridge. Yet internal divisions in those cities contrasted with the civic unity of Kansas City. I'm sure you've all heard of Kansas City Nice. I mean, it's a long-standing tradition in Kansas City that we're very nice. And that the founders of Kansas City emphasized, above all else, even though they were divided on slavery, they emphasized unity in the essential matter of economic development. So Kansas City got the railroad bridge. I'm sorry. So if you could turn right there we are, okay? It was the opening of, if it weren't for the Hannibal Railroad Bridge, I think we would probably we wouldn't be sitting here this morning. We'd be sitting in St. Joe or Atchison or Leavenworth. So this railroad bridge is essential to the history of Kansas City. It led ultimately to Kansas City being the second largest rail hub in the United States, second only to Chicago. By the late 1800s, there were 32 railroad lines converging in Kansas City, which had an important effect, which was that to get anywhere across the country, you had to come through Kansas City. And that led to Kansas City becoming very much in the mainstream of intellectual thought, becoming a real place of convergence for the country. It also allowed Kansas Cityans to travel extensively and easily throughout the country, as they did. The breakneck pace of growth in Kansas City from the 500 in 1865 to 32,000 in 1870 created a society that was uprooted. I might just say also that census of 1870 was, it's often said that maybe there weren't 32,000 people. That might have been more of a Chamber of Commerce number. But the fact remains that the city grew rapidly because of the Hannibal Railroad Bridge. And into this, you had a society that was growing rapidly. They were displaced from other places. They had relatively fragile, if any, kin networks or friendship networks. There were there were all kinds of man-made and natural disasters like grasshopper plagues, depressions, tornadoes, etc. And so there was a need for people who had very little to have some ability to have access, some sort of public relief system. Slide. Sarah W. Coates serves as an exemplar of the transplanted Easterner who brought the northern perspective and important personal connections to bear on the formation of Kansas City society. Sarah Coates was probably undoubtedly the leading woman in Kansas City of her age. Sarah Coates, a new bride from eastern Pennsylvania, had left her well-established surroundings in the east to venture with her lawyer and businessman husband Kersey Coates to their new frontier home. The strange world that Sarah Coates encountered in Kansas City in 1856, streets of mud, poorly constructed, hastily constructed buildings, accommodations crowded with Easterners heading to Kansas, was experienced by many other people as they reached the city in the mid-1850s. Sarah Coates was at the vanguard of progressive social thought, rather than being a typical example of a woman of her time. Her disciplined Quaker upbringing and her association with people of prominence no doubt account for her perception of herself, as noted in her diary, as, quote, not like most other women, but rather hardier, more disciplined, and more willing to meet the challenges as they faced her with calm and equanimity. She was born in 1828 to a very prosperous Quaker family in Kennett Square, Chester County, Pennsylvania, not far from Philadelphia. Her personal philosophy was shaped by her Quaker heritage and upbringing. Coates' progressive spirit and that of the Kennett Square community extended to equal suffrage, the education of Native peoples, women's property rights, opposition to slavery. And very, very important to understand how progressive the Quaker community, and particularly Sarah Coates were. The movement to include women in higher education and the professions developed in this era. A relative and close friend of Coates was Dr. Ann Preston, an early graduate of the Philadelphia Women's Medical College. Dr. Preston, Sarah Coates' cousin, was the first woman to achieve professorial status in an American university and the first woman dean of a medical school. Wow. The evolution of the social construction of gender from true woman who clung to the domestic sphere to the new woman who was actively engaged in the world through education and career accelerated with the founding of women's colleges in the 1860s, think the Seven Sisters, and the admission of women to other colleges and universities, such as Oberlin, to women, and the increase in the number of women enrolled in higher ed and the professions were all very evident. And Sarah Coates favored this movement of women into the professions and into higher education. What is really important to note is that more women as a percentage of the population were enrolled in higher education and active in the professions, law, medicine, dentistry, than in the decades of the 1910s and 1920s, than would be again until the 1970s. This golden age began to erode in the 1920s due to a reaction against professional women. They were constructed as maladjusted for not wanting families, because there's this dichotomous view that either you had a career or you had family. So if you chose the career, you were maladjusted in the 1920s. They were mocked as an indeterminate sex or as mannish lesbians. This reaction, followed by the Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war consumer society that constructed women as homemakers, think June Cleaver, caused collective amnesia concerning the prior period of women's progress. So by the it was an awakening in the 1970s that we had forgotten for previous decades. But women were making great progress from the 1850s through the 1920s. But I digress. Sarah Coates enjoyed a lifetime association with luminaries in the suffrage movement, such as Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Communication with Anthony in particular continued over Sarah Coates' lifetime. Coates held a luncheon in Kansas City in 1892 in Anthony's honor. It suffices to say that Coates knew and was known by the intelligentsia of her time. The new society, well, you go back to Sarah Coates. The new society that existed in Kansas City in 1870, as I said, provided the opening for women like Coates, who subscribed to any one or more of the three streams of women's activism to become active. Those three streams are, as my book title suggests, benevolence, reform, and equality. Benevolence refers to assisting the poor. It was generally conducted by elite women affiliated with high status religions such as the Episcopal Church or the Presbyterian Church. Women of affluence sought to assist the poor without questioning the systematic causes of poverty. Rather, they and much of the rest of society sought to blame the poor for their predicament. It was, they believed, a result of moral failing. The second stream of thought is moral reform, which refers to eliminating threats to the collective sense of morality by, for example, prohibiting alcohol and prostitution. This set of activities was usually conducted by middle-class women affiliated with what were called the enthusiastic religions, those being Methodists and Baptists. Egalitarianism, or equality, refers to ensuring equal rights for women and minorities, and was generally conducted by Quakers and Unitarians. In the East, separate organizations served these disparate ends. But in Kansas City, women of all three of these strains of thought came together in 1870 to assist the poor woman, the fallen woman, and the woman who lacked rights on an equal footing with men. And as a result, a charitably inclined Protestant women's organization met with some trepidation about stepping into the public sphere in 1870 to form the Women's Christian Association. The actions of the founding members of the WCA reflected the willingness and even the desire to extend the hearth into the street, the bordello, and the legal and electoral arenas. These women reflected three different points of view, yet coalesced to form a single citywide organization of Protestant women where none had existed. By December 1870, the WCA looked forward to the founding of a home for the friendless to assist single women in the unwelcoming urban environment. And it's important to note that in this time, the urban environment was extremely unwelcoming to women. Women had to live under the protection of a man, a husband, a father, a brother, an uncle. They could not walk on the street. They could not go into eating or drinking establishments by themselves. Otherwise, their sexual, they would be viewed as prostitutes or sexually suspect. As the 1870s progressed, however, benevolent women, those of wealth, came to dominate the WCA, the Women's Christian Association. That should somehow come as no surprise. And the other two strains of women's activism, reform and equality, had no organized home. Sarah Coates had feet in both the benevolent and the egalitarian camps. She was both the wealthiest woman in Kansas City by far, and she was an egalitarian Quaker. A reduced membership in the WCA with an increasing population to serve left the organization unable to meet the needs of the community. In 1880, prominent men of the business and professional class formed the Provident Association with some reluctance to bring greater resources to address the needs of impoverished Kansas Cityans. And I might mention the WCA continues to exist today in the form of Gillis services for children, and what was until recently called Armor Home, or Armor Memorial Home, which is now Armor Oaks, Armor Oaks. The Provident Association exists today as the Family Conservancy. So both of these organizations continue in an unbroken line all these years later, which I think is quite remarkable. Great. Clara Hoffman and Frances Willard. What happened to those reform and egalitarian-minded women when the benevolent women took over the WCA? I'm sure you're asking yourselves that very question. The first group that arose was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The National Women's Christian Temperance Union had its roots in the protests of women in Ohio against alcohol in 1873. The organization was founded nationally in 1874. It grew to 344,000 members nationwide by 1920. Unlike today's popular image of the WCTU, to the extent that there is a popular image of the WCTU, it is of a group of women who were concerned that somewhere, somehow, someone was having fun, and they had to stop it. But the reality is greatly different from that popular perception. In fact, the WCTU was a great group of very engaged, active women, and they supported. They were on the vanguard of social reforms, such as women's suffrage. Prohibition was a means to an end. Give us the vote, we will bring in prohibition, was the argument. Prohibition was a means to an end. It would take woman suffrage to end the scourge of alcohol, they argued. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed and active in Kansas City by 1881. All of the organizations that were founded after the Women's Christian Association were local chapters of national organizations. Clara Hoffman. Has anyone heard of Clara Hoffman? You have. Very, very interesting. Clara Hoffman exemplified the Kansas City activist with national ties. She served for 25 years as the president of the Missouri Women's Christian Temperance Union. During that time, she also served for 12 years as the national recording secretary of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was a close associate of Frances Willard, the longtime national president, and traveled the country on behalf of the WCTU, using this wonderful train system that was available to Kansas Cityans. Their issues included public water fountains, suffrage, child labor laws, prohibition, female jail matrons, public parks, reading rooms, coffee houses for working people, and not least, world peace. Willard was arguably the most famous woman of her day. In fact, an elementary school in Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas, were named for Willard. The Frances Willard School, not far from where it was torn down just a couple of years ago, but it was not far from here. The fact that schools in adjoining municipalities each had Frances Willard schools, I think, speaks to her, the regard that the public had for Frances Willard. It was what WCTU's early and passionate embrace of suffrage that made the issue safe for other women's groups by 1910. Without the early and steadfast work of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, I would argue that suffrage would not have happened as soon as it did. Yet in spite of Clara Hoffman's national stature, the Kansas City historian Carrie Westlake Whitney, in her Encyclopedia of Kansas City and its Prominent People, placed her biographical sketch within that of her husband, physician Dr. Goswin Hoffman, a native of Germany who died in 1883. She is not referenced in the table of contents, but her biography of her is included within her husband's entry. Clara Hoffman was born in rural New York to a wealthy farming family. When she arrived in Kansas City with her husband in 1871, Hoffman was, according to Westlake Whitney, deeply interested in all that pertains to intellectual and moral progress, to reform and improvement. Yet Hoffman, a married woman with children, led a life that was uncharacteristic of a married, high-status woman. Before becoming the state Women's Christian Temperance Union president, she taught and served as principal of the Lathrop School for 12 years. She was also an early and active member of the high-status First Congregational Church. So through the work of women such as Clara Hoffman, the Women's Christian Temperance Union became a force for reform and equality at the state, national, and local levels. Mary Harmon Weeks, another national group with a large and powerful voice in Kansas City, was the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which continues to function today. The organization nationally came into existence in 1889 to meet the needs of women of the leisure class. By 1892, 20,000 women were members of Women's Christian, were members of General Federation clubs. And by 1900, 150,000 women in the United States belonged. Like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the clubs provided a venue for women to learn about public life through public speaking, running for office, and thinking on a community-wide basis. The General Federation of Women's Clubs arrived in Kansas City in 1893. The most significant and best known of the women's clubs is the Kansas City Athenaeum. Scholars often argue that the General Federation of Women's Club members were primarily interested in projects that didn't require them to get their hands particularly dirty. But that was not the case in Kansas City. In 1893, the year of the founding, members surveyed the county poor farm and asked that the insane patients be sent to a properly conducted asylum, among other items of business. By 1896, 21 clubs operated in Kansas City. It is interesting to note that there is very little overlap among the memberships of the various women's groups in Kansas City. It is also interesting that the Kansas City Athenaeum, the largest one of the clubs, had at least 2 Jewish members, which reflects an interfaith attitude that was consistent with Kansas City history. It is a fact that generally the large, prestigious, primarily Protestant women's clubs in any city generally had at least a few members representing the elite strata of the Jewish community. Such was the case of Hannah Greenbaum Solomon, who founded the National Council of Jewish Women. She was a member of what predominantly Protestant prestigious club in Chicago. One GFWC and Athenaeum member, Mary Harmon Weeks, who's pictured here, was a leading figure in education at the national and local levels. An Ohioan born in 1851, she came to Kansas City and earned a teaching certificate in 1868. She began teaching mathematics at what would become Central High School in Kansas City at the age of 17. Younger, of course, than many of her students. She was an early advocate of such things as the kindergarten movement, the Mothers Union movement that evolved into the PTA in 1906. She was also National Secretary of the Congress of Mothers and Vice President of the National Congress of Parents and Teachers from 1911 to 1916. In addition to her education work, Weeks served in the community in other capacities, in significant capacities. She was a member of the Kansas City Arts Commission in 1906. The commission operated at the height of the City Beautiful movement that gave Kansas City the phenomenal parks and boulevard system that we enjoy even today. The Arts Commission sought to bring order to the chaos of the urban environment and resulted in the development of the park system. George E. Kessler served on that. George E. Kessler, the designer, the landscape architect who designed the Parks and Boulevard system, served with Weeks on that commission. 4 months after the entry of the U.S. into World War I, Weeks served as the chair of the local branch of the National Council of Defense. She led the effort in July of 1917 to register 83,000 women in Kansas City for the purpose, as described by the Star, of filling such places as they can in the industrial and commercial life of the city, made vacant by men going to war. There were other significant women's organizations that tend not to have such highly prominent women's names associated with them. They include the Catholic Women's League, the Catholic Ladies Aid Society, the National Council of Jewish Women, the Young Women's Christian Association, as well as organizations that formed in the aftermath of the Civil War, such as the Ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Women's Relief Corps. The Daughters of the Confederacy enjoyed substantial popular support among fashionable Kansas City society, so much so that they held well-attended cotillions in such places as the Hotel Baltimore, which was a prestigious location in Kansas City at one time. The desire for post-war reunion is also very much in evidence by the surprising visit of Jefferson Davis to Kansas City in 1876. He was hosted by former Union and Confederate partisans. While the Daughters of the Confederacy held their cotillions in highly fashionable places, the Ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic held an old-fashioned bean supper in the basement of the Broadway Methodist Church to raise funds for their cause. So you can see this great contrast between the Daughters of the Confederacy and women's organizations affiliated with the Grand Army of the Republic. Next slide, please. The degree of inclusion of African Americans in the organizations varied. The Women's Christian Temperance Union had African American chapters. The General Federation of Women's Clubs had African American clubs, but African American women were not able to attend their national convention. The YWCA had branches for African American women, but the branches were subject to the approval of the main white office downtown. The same situation was the case for the YMCAs. In this context, the National Association of Colored Women formed in 1895 through the leadership of anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells is a name that has unfortunately largely faded from history. She was an extremely significant woman. She was born a slave in Mississippi and experienced Reconstruction in Mississippi. She saw African American people in positions of authority in the Mississippi state government. She did not understand why they could not continue in positions of authority. She was born a slave. She became a newspaper owner in Memphis. She dared to suggest at a time when black men were being socially constructed as rapists, she dared to suggest that if there was so much sexual activity going on between black men and white women, that perhaps white women had played a role in that. That was an incendiary claim, in the South and in the United States in particular. And she was driven out of Memphis before she probably would have been murdered. But she was an anti-lynching activist. Thousands of primarily black men were lynched in the South and even in the Midwest and other places in the United States. Ida B. Wells took her anti-lynching campaign to Britain because at that time the United States was very concerned about what the British thought of American society. They didn't want to be seen as rubes. She put great pressure on American society to stop lynching. She got into a kerfuffle with Frances Willard, a well-known kerfuffle. But ultimately, there was no anti-lynching law passed until the 1940s in the United States. Ida B. Wells addressed the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Kansas City on one of her trips through town. but it was to no effect. She was well known. When her name appeared in the Kansas City Star in an article, there was no explanation as to who she was, because she was that well known. They didn't need an explanation as to who she was. The National Association of Colored Women brought together African American women's clubs that had already formed. The only appearance of the organization in the Kansas City Star that I could find occurred on July 14th of 1901, when Josephine Siloam Yates, who was described as a teacher in Kansas City for many years, and this is Josephine Siloam Yates, that's Ida B. Wells. When Josephine Siloam Yates defeated Margaret Murray Washington for the presidency of the national organization. Margaret Murray Washington was the wife of Booker T. Washington. You can imagine someone from Kansas City beating out Mrs. Booker T. Washington for the presidency organization. That was substantial. The Star article included the inaccurate editorial comment that Yates is one of the few enthusiastic workers along educational lines in Kansas City, among the colored. Much more needs to be said about Yates. She was born in 1859 in New York State. She became the first African American to teach school in Rhode Island, in a public school. In 1879, she came to Missouri and taught at the Lincoln Institute, which is now the Lincoln University in Jefferson City. In 1889, she married W.W. Yates, who was then principal of the Wendell Phillips School in Kansas City, and there is still a functioning W.W. Yates School in the Kansas City, Missouri public schools. As a married woman, she was prohibited from teaching. She devoted her time to the club movement among African American women. After her husband's death in 1910, she returned to teaching, this time at Lincoln High School in Kansas City. She died in 1912 at the age of 53. Next slide, please. The high point of the women's political movement came with the ratification, as we're well aware, this is the centennial year, of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution extending the right of women to vote. It is here that the linear narrative of women's empowerment becomes complicated as women sought and gained local political offices, starting with municipal elections in 1922, when Emma Longan, also someone after whom a school in Kansas City was named, for her husband, and Margaret Shepard were elected to the upper house of the two-house city council, and the first woman was elected to the Kansas City School Board, former Athenaeum president Carolyn Fuller. And you can see that there was this tremendous uncertainty as to what was going to happen once you enfranchised half the population. There were some states that had already enfranchised women. Kansas was, I think, the 8th in 1910. But other states were not. So this appeared in the Kansas City Journal, and it's politicians courting the women's votes. How were women going to vote? It was a matter of substantial concern and conjecture. The interest, the intensity of women's desire to serve on the school board even led for calls from the Kansas City Athenaeum for legendary businessman and noted philanthropist William Volker to retire from his school board seat so that women could fill it. I mean, consider that. William Volker was a legend, and to suggest that, for prominent women to suggest that he leave his seat so women could fill it was quite courageous. Macy Jones, we can go to the next slide. Macy Jones Regan, who is another phenomenal person whose name has been lost to history, was elected to a seat on the Kansas City School Board and Kansas City Council in 1924. This was the second election after women were enfranchised. Regan embodied not just the political, but also the professional aspirations of her sex. Regan took up the study of law late in life. She was a grandmother when she graduated summa cum laude from the Kansas City School of Law, along with 5 other women in the class of 1921. So you can see that women were on the ascendancy at that point. I think there were probably around 30 members of that class in 1921, and she was one of 5 women. Following graduation, she served as the attorney for the Kansas City Athenaeum, and in 1923 she was elected to represent the Athenaeum on the Water and Charter Committee to write the new city charter. What is so, among the many interesting aspects of Regan's life is the fact that she exercised power and influence in spite of her status as a divorced woman, a status that caused people generally in that age to be shunned by society, particularly women. She's buried in Union Cemetery with her parents, who have a very, I've not explored this in any great detail, but her parents' headstone is a large, prominent obelisk, which leads me to assume that perhaps they were people of influence and affluence, and that perhaps shielded Macy Jones Regan from the public shunning that would have befallen most other women at the time. Regan became a flashpoint in the efforts by the Athenaeum and other progressive women's organizations to elect a woman to the nine-member city council created under the new city charter of 1925. That new charter under the new charter of 1925, Kansas City went from a large 36-member two-house city council structure to the strong mayor, to the strong city manager, weak mayor city council structure with 8 members of the city council and the mayor sitting as a voting member of the city council. The new charter represented the culmination of 2 previous initiatives, one in 1917 and the other in 1922, to move the city toward a more modern, so to speak, nine-member council. The idea behind this change was part of the progressive era emphasis on efficiency. And people really thought that by changing the structure, you could take politics out of city government. There's this managerial philosophy that people thought was going to assist with the efficiency of city government. Yet I think we all know that it is impossible to remove politics from city government, just as it is from county government, state government, national and international politics. The council would be comprised of most members, of 9 members, as I said. Scholars argue that this and other similar initiatives were designed less to increase efficiency and more to eliminate the governance of cities by people that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants didn't want running their cities, particularly the Irish and the Italians. It was a way of reorganizing them, reforming government so that they couldn't have a seat. Reversing his opposition to 2 previous charter revisions, Kansas City political boss Tom Pendergast endorsed the 1925 charter. He understood intuitively what some of his better educated opponents failed to grasp, that political structures matter little if he had the votes to control the majority of the seats on the new council. He said it's just as easy, it's easier to make 5 friends than it is to make the majority of friends on the much larger city council structure. Pendergast's musings proved prescient. Macy Jones Regan secured the nomination for an at-large council seat from the Republicans with the support of the Kansas City Athenaeum. The legitimate desire of progressive women to claim a higher level of power in the new 9-member city council structure, however, clashed directly with the imperative of progressives, led by Mayor Albert I. Beach, to deprive the machine of a majority of the seats. Beach was concerned that a woman candidate would be unsuccessful and would endanger the progressive success in winning a majority of council seats. He was right. On election day, Regan lost her race narrowly, and the machine picked up 5 of the 9 city council seats. The Republican mayor, who was to exercise greatly reduced power under the new charter, faced a majority of machine politicians on the council, which then selected the city manager. And I think we all know how that went. The progressives' loss was the machine's gain. Pendergast won political control of the city government and held it for the next 13 years. Fewer than 2,000 votes, fewer than 200 votes determined the outcome. So we have to always get away from the idea, as you all are so well aware, that one vote doesn't matter. One vote matters tremendously in certain circumstances. Far from promoting business-like efficiency in city operations, the new charter facilitated corruption on a scale that the public became aware of only after the machine's demise. No woman would win a seat on the city council again until Helen Hunt Miller succeeded her husband, 3rd District Councilman George J. Miller, in the 1950s. Next slide, please. Women's search for power in the community board success, however, in the arena of education. That's due at least in part to because of the fact that the education of children is socially constructed as an appropriate role for women. For reasons that remain unclear, the political machine that dominated other governmental units in Kansas City left the Kansas City School Board untouched. Prominent members, the highest level of Kansas City society, served on the Kansas City School Board, including William Volker, J.C. Nichols, Robert Mahorney, and others. Community leaders may well have had an informal understanding with the machine that the school board was off limits to their control. This lack of machine involvement and its accompanying patriarchal structure provided an opening for women to seek and gain elective office. School board elections in Kansas City operated under a unique, very unique set of circumstances, set of rules. At the school board elections, each party nominated a candidate, always white, for one of 2 available seats. The candidate did not face opposition. For example, in April 1924, voters elected both Edward C. Messervy and J.C. Nichols. Messervy was a Republican, J.C. Nichols was a Democrat. Each was unopposed. Carolyn Fuller's election to the Kansas City School Board in 1922, remember she was the one who suggested that Volker resign his seat, signaled the start of a long tradition of service in Kansas City by women on the Kansas City School Board. In 1926, Annette Moore, you can't see that, Annette Moore is there, Carolyn Fuller is there. Annette Moore, who was a classmate of Macy Jones Regan in 1921 in the law school, was elected to the school board and held her position until 1950. Between 1926 and 1945, at least 2 of the 7 members were women. Moore and Fuller served together until 1934 when Mrs. Frank E. Dorsey joined the board. A physician, Dr. Hester Wilson, again a professional woman, succeeded Moore as the vice president of the board in 1944. In spite of the electoral success of these 4 women and their status as elected officials in a gender-appropriate role, none of them advanced beyond committee chair and vice president to lead the board as president. That would have been, I suppose, just taking things too far. Middle and upper class women in Kansas City continued their activism in the face of election irregularities and violence in the polls during the Pendergast era, and much of this is well known. In the election of 1934, electoral conflict between machine and reformers, and the reformers were known as the Citizens Fusion Ticket, resulted in the deaths of 5 Kansas Cityans. In 1937, a federal grand jury returned numerous indictments of charges of election fraud for the 1936 elections. The previous grand jury of 1935, looking at the elections of 1934, had failed to return indictments because it felt at the time that the city was, quote, so infested with lawlessness that citizens are afraid to tell the truth to the grand jury. By 1936, that had changed, and there were many convictions on election fraud charges. The Pendergast machine's fall occurred on April 7th, 1939, when Pendergast and former state insurance superintendent Emmett O'Malley were indicted on income tax evasion charges, which is so often how people are brought down. stemming from the funds they received for exercising influence in an insurance settlement. The business community, which had long taken the influence of the machine as an immutable fact of daily life, and had not united against or with the machine, quickly coalesced to form the Forward Kansas City Committee. Progressive women added their support, organizational skills, and time. By June 1939, the committee included representatives of the PTA, the Visiting Nurse Association, the League of Women Voters, the University Women's Club, the Athenaeum, the Women's City Club, the YWCA, the Women's Chamber of Commerce, and PEO, among others. Claude Gordon, who had previously led reforms as the Secretary of the Association of Criminal Justice in the 1920s. And Claude Gordon, if you go back into the 1920s, she was everywhere. She was a very, very prominent, respected, powerful actor in Kansas City. She led the women's campaign. Amendments to the city charter were approved in the election of 1940. The primary revisions reduced the terms of sitting council members from 4 years to 2, provided 2-year terms for city council members, the mayor, and 2 municipal judges, and required that elections for a new city council be held in April of that year. The new city charter passed handily. The reform campaign, which was supported by groups within the African American community and the women's committee, intensified their efforts in preparation for the municipal elections of April 1940. They supported John B. Gage as the candidate for mayor for the United campaign, as it was now known. Gordon, who claimed a long familial association with the Democratic Party, served as a visible spokesperson for the campaign, just as she had for the charter amendments. Women, and a story that's well known to many of us, volunteered as telephone coordinators, drivers, babysitters for mothers when they went to the polls. They were also poll observers and noted infractions of election law that were reported to the police or to the election commission. The success of the United campaign resulted in a comfortable win for Gage and plaudits for the women's efforts, not just in the Kansas City Star and Times, but also in papers across the country, such as the New York Times, which credited the women's campaign for finishing the Pendergast dynasty. And here's the famous photograph of the victory. The man at the piano is none other than William Volker's son-in-law, Luthnow, who wrote Mr. Anonymous. So everything ties together. The triumph of the United campaign and the prominent role played by middle and upper class women underlines the continuous arc of women's activism in Kansas City. Women negotiated the boundaries of the public sphere, achieved suffrage, and with it, a measure of political power. They ran for public office, meeting with initial success in the city and school board elections of 1922, and subsequently finding sustained success only on the school board. These women remained united in their desire for activism, which found expressions in such areas as educational policies and fit within the social construct of gender. At the same time, women who were not of that class, whose names reflected perhaps Irish roots and a faith of the Roman Catholic faith rather than Protestant, lost power and influence as the last vestiges of the Pendergast machine crumbled. So while we want to tell a linear story of good versus evil, it was the empowerment, it was the, if you will, resurgence of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Kansas City and the diminishment of Catholic Kansas City, Irish Kansas City, Italian Kansas City. So it's not one easy, quick narrative. There's nuance there. There's a question of gain and loss and who wins and who loses. However, it's important to remember that women remained united and cohesive in their desire for political expression. As we look at the history of organizations such as the Women's Christian Association, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the National Association of Colored Women, the National Council of Jewish Women, and many others, We see that Kansas City is better for the institutions they founded, the ideas they advocated, and the examples they set for women and men to follow. Thank you very much.